Lisa and Janelle Iglesias. I'll read their bio here. So Las Hermanas Iglesias is a project-based collaboration by two sisters, which incorporates a variety of relationships and structures for collectivity. Lisa Iglesias grounds her individual practice in drawing and painting across a variety of materials and processes. Janelle Iglesias works with and through objects to create sculpture and installation. Las Hermanas speaks to their identities as woven into histories and philosophies of feminism and collaboration. As the children of Norwegian and Dominican immigrants who grew up in Queens, New York City, their project-based transdisciplinary work explores issues of hybridity, social participation, and transnational identities. Their collective has fluidly evolved to include a number of team efforts and variations, including steady collaborations with their mother, Bodhild, through employing playful structures that respond to the community and geographical context of each project. Las Hermanas Iglesias creates artworks that disrupt borders, engage absurdity, and promote the benefits of working together. So I want to give them a warm welcome for us here at Ball State. I was very lucky to have actually met them in Qatar. We were talking about it a little earlier, our memories of the desert. And I still have actually also the risograph book that you made of palindromes. And I have kept that as just a reminder of your playful spirit. And I was really impressed by your warmth, both as people and also as artists. So I am just so excited to have you here, and that Lisa will also be working with the drawing students on Monday in narrative drawing. So with that, I'll give it to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We're so happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as Janelle mentioned, this is such a beautiful opportunity to be with we're in an intimate group. So if you want to have, you can put your questions into the chat, you can put your questions into the YouTube function, and then we can, as a group, kind of react to anything that comes up. So thank you so much, Rachel. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you, Ball State. Janelle and I are really excited to join you. And here we put in her little handle and website, and Janelle put the website into the chat. If you would like to see some examples of our work that kind of extend beyond the presentation, Janelle and I are not necessarily going to focus on our individual practices today. We're going to focus on our collaborative projects. So if you're curious what we do individually, check out the website. And Janelle is going to start out with a land acknowledgement for San Diego.
So my name is Janelle Iglesias. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm zooming in from San Diego, California, which is the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation.
And I'm Lisa. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you from South Hadley, Massachusetts, located on the traditional homelands of the Nipmuc and the Pecumtuck. And it's one of the reasons we're so excited to be here with you is because we are coming to you from these different spaces, and that Janelle and I are coming to you from these pedagogical contexts, which brought us to those places, right? And so we're really excited to meet with fellow educators and fellow artists and students, because that's a really big part of our identity as well, are educators, right? Yeah.
So Lisa and I have been collaborating for the past about 15 years under the moniker Las Hermanas Iglesias. We are the youngest of 4 daughters, and growing up, and we grew up in Queens, New York. Growing up, we were always kind of associated as Lisa and Janelle. We're not twins, we're about 14 months apart, and so we really grew up in this way of being sort of treated as a duo, and really always thought about ourselves in relation to each other and in relation to our family, very much so. So when naming our collaboration, it was really organic that we chose this name Las Hermanas, because embedded in it was this idea of collaboration, this idea of relationality, and this idea of sisterhood.
Multiplicity, collectivity, and this idea that, as Janelle mentioned, this relativity to each other, to our family members, to our borough, and that this sort of collaboration that Janelle and I kind of officially began in 2005. Also, Nick goes back to when we were very like babies and collaborating and working through and with all of the kind of challenges that it comes to being daughters, that it comes with being siblings. And so this you go.
Oh yeah, one of the things I think this drawing from 1982, when I was 2 years old and Lisa was 3 years old, illustrates is that I think a lot of people often kind of romanticize the idea of working with your sibling, and it is pretty romantic. We both feel very lucky in terms of just having the kind of grace of having somebody that you're so close to, being able to work with them. But there's also all of the familial tensions that you have only with your siblings and only with people that you're that close with, that you have to contend with as well. And so I think when we found this drawing in the kind of family archive, we couldn't stop laughing, because there's sort of this shade thrown with the pen marks are from my sister Janelle, and the fact that sister is spelled wrong as well. It's pretty lovely. I think it also speaks to a continual back and forth, a kind of dialogic process of working on each other's work, quote unquote, and kind of blurring the eyes, blurring lines of authorship, and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable is something that we're really interested in.
So Janelle and I often root a lot of our decision making, a lot of how we ground our projects and how we contextualize ourselves, like through, of course, this lineage of parentage, our experience being second generation, growing up in Queens, as Janelle mentioned, and that our parents had these very specific experiences of immigration. Our mother growing up in a very, very rural part of Norway, and our father growing up in an extremely urbanized environment in the Dominican Republic, in the capital in Santo Domingo. And then they eventually moved as they settled as adults in Queens, where they met each other and had kids, which is then how we came about. And we trace that kind of distance, the prevalence of a multilingual presence, sort of abilities and dissonances and inabilities to translate language. All of those things were huge factors as we were growing up, and continue to factor into our work. This is one of our really early works that Janelle and I created together during graduate school. So either at a similar time frame as some of you, or a little not so far off from where all of you are studying right now, for those of you who are students. And these works would start out with one of us putting marks on a piece of paper, either through a physical material like masking tape in the upper left, or tracing shadow. As you can see on the right-hand side, those two that are on top of each other are traced shadows, or like putting the paper through with a sewing machine and tracing someone else's marks. So we would start out this prompt and mail it to each other. Janelle was living at the time in Virginia, and I was living at the time in Florida. And we, just as Janelle mentioned, this kind of dialogic call and response conversation, this layering of mark making, is how we started out again as somewhat more of adults in 2005, sending these back and forth through the mail. And just even speaking to the power of what a faculty member can do in terms of connecting people to different communities and such, is that at that time we weren't showing them really to anyone, but eventually we did show them to one of my professors at UF, Ron Janowicz, who then curated two of these collaborative drawings into a show about collaboration with Will Pappenheimer, and in New York City. So that was like our first show and our first need to have a name for what we were doing, kind of intuitively, and then it became much more official.
And this is a practice, this kind of going back and forth, sending things through the mail, but also taking this box of paper, works on paper out, and continuing to kind of have this visual conversation with those works on paper is something that we've continued throughout our practice as a kind of grounding strategy, as sometimes a way to brainstorm or to think through things, or get started if we haven't seen each other in a while to break the ice, but also to keep keep a thread going throughout our practice as well. So this is something that I'm and Lisa and I are still doing to this day, is sending these works on paper back and forth, and they continue to change alongside the work that we're making in our own studios individually, as well as the work that we're making collaboratively. And so that's been a really fun thing to see, is a kind of visual conversation that's changing over time, and the way that palettes are changing and strategies are changing. Oftentimes these pieces of paper get repainted over and over and over, so that we don't necessarily think of them as finished objects, but that they're shown in whatever state they happen to be in when we're making them. There's no rules, and so they can be cut up and recollaged or cut through or reassembled. And this is also a strategy that we've used with other different kinds of projects and techniques that we've kind of applied that improvisational practice towards other times when we've come together to make a body of work. So this was a body of work that we made while in Qatar when we met Rachel, which we wanted to show, where we both worked on a series of screen prints that were, or the whole series was completely variable. And we just kept adding and taking away and cutting through on these screen prints. And so the backside and the front side, often the backside had a full color that was printed on it, so that when we cut through a shape and perhaps folded it over, you got this this additional visual mark as well. And sometimes we would put another print behind them so that there would be this kind of layering of prints. And layering of materials. We were also using the laser cutter to cut through plexi, and also using some of these plexiglass parts that came out as shapes that we would run through the press. And so we were kind of taking all of these different shapes and creating this kind of visual language or conversation that was morphing and changing with each print.
And I think part of that too is this idea that, like Janelle mentioned, you could see the front side and the back side, that it really privileged a multiplicity of perspective and viewpoints. So in many of our works, we're trying to, yes, blur the boundaries between, is this a 2D work? Is it three-dimensional? Is it a print? Can we turn the print into a variable, unique, then do some hand painting and paper cutting on, and then add plexi. So we like to kind of blur around these categories. And also like this idea of translation, that one mark can then be kind of filtered through a process so that it turns into something else. And as Rachel mentioned, we work very closely with our mom, Bodhild, and that part of our collaborative structure is super important to us. This is an example where we curate from this kind of like stack of works on paper that we've collected, and we'll curate from them and talk with our mom about how to transform them into textile pieces. And that happens in a variety of different ways that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but this is kind of linking the textile works right away to these visual conversations on paper and canvas. And that particular piece that you saw on the right is now here as in a painting that has a hinge on it. So then again, like talking about, it goes beyond this idea of it being a static painting. It's not a tapestry. It's not a knit. It's not a painting. Like these things can have a multiplicity of identities, and that kind of that kind of ethos comes up again and again in our projects.
So we're really interested in resisting these like very strict definitions of how something operates, and also really interested in ways in which the viewer can become kind of implicated in viewing the work and experiencing the work. And so one has to be curious enough to try to open the painting to find these small sculptures that are underneath. We've also been experimenting with making work with Lisa's son, Bowie, who is 8 years old right now. I think the work that we made in this particular show often had small sculptures that he made when he was about 6 that were hiding in different places in the gallery. And so this body of work, we were also kind of referring to things that were going on in our personal lives and in our kind of subconscious. And one of those things was playing a lot of hide and go seek at the time, and this kind of joy of looking and finding things.
And connected with this kind of material idea of where there doesn't need to be this strict binary between one definition and another. I think that some of our earliest ways of how Janelle and I were collaborating on alongside those works on paper are these very early works where we were blurring the boundaries of where she and I began and ended, so that we would braid our hair together. One of the earliest times that we collaborated with our mother was to ask that she knit us a conjoined dress that we would wear, and fusing our nails together. So these kind of gestures and these wearable sculptures and like suggestions of performative potential, we're questioning the boundaries between who we were as individuals.
I think we also always saw Las Hermanas as this kind of sculptable entity, as a kind of the idea of collaboration being central to our practice, that we could experiment with what being a collaborative team means and what working together means. And so that might be, you know, implicating ourselves in the work. It might mean taking turns. It might mean something kind of dialogic, or one person captaining a decision-making process on each time. But it's always, I feel like, something that we're not necessarily taking for granted or setting as a default, but we're questioning how we're going to come to a collaboration, and what form a project will take, and kind of making a map for ourselves about what we want to get out of the project and how we want to approach the project as a team.
This is one of those projects that is an example of certain decisions and certain fabrication we did individually. Like, it was important to us that Janelle make a self-portrait of herself and I make a self-portrait of myself using the form of the piñata, and then that we have we agreed on this structure where that Janelle would beat up my piñata and I would in turn beat up her piñata. So sometimes we set up these rules or these kind of like this sort of logic that makes sense for us for whatever reason at the time, like it's contextual for each project. And in this one, of course, it was very important that the candies that are traditionally found in piñatas would be red and suggestive of viscera. And it's one of these projects that I think really foregrounds that we like for things to be touched and taken away and dwindled and full of flux and shifting characteristics, and that the audience can, you know, be involved in that kind of work. And of course, shout out to Felix Gonzalez Torres. And that's also like a playful nod to the candy spills by one of our favorite artists.
This is a project called Everybody Likes to Dance, and was one of our early collaborative practices where we're also really thinking through our family history and thinking through ways that we identify very much as being from Queens, New York, which is this extremely diverse place in New York City, one of the most diverse, you know, cities in the country, albeit the world. And so this was a piece that we made for the Queens Museum the first time that it was produced. And we asked our mom and our dad to come up with a song that they really identified with dancing when they were younger. And our mom chose a pulse, which is a little bit like a polka and is played with the fiddle. And our father chose a merengue. And so from each of their countries, they chose this Norwegian pulse, this Dominican merengue. And then we worked with 5 musicians and asked them to create a mashup of these 2 different songs. There were no other instructions given. And so it could be something very seamless and danceable, or it could be something that sounded much more like sound art that was discordant and much, could be super long. It didn't have to fit on like a sort of, you know, normal 3 or 4 or 5 minute song track. There were no kind of rules established. And so one of the things we were interested in seeing what would happen and letting go a little bit, and also not necessarily wanting to romanticize this idea of a mashup or of this kind of hybridity, but really looking at all the different ways that this could happen. And we also learned the dance steps for both of those dances in this project and created a dance diagram of a kind of mashup dance that implicated both steps and put them together in our own kind of new form of the dance. And so this is a hand-painted painting, but it's on the floor, so it also acts as a dance floor. And viewers are invited to take off their shoes and perform this dance diagram, this dance. And the music is playing in the space, and there are these kind of hybrid disco balls that play above. And Lisa's going to play a little bit from one of the mashups by a collaborator named Chris Goris. And so you can hear the Norwegian fiddle playing, and also the lyrics from Baile con Pedro Juan, which is the Dominican merengue, in there as well. And this was this kind of dance diagram is also a nod, like Lisa was talking about, with that kind of nod to Felix Gonzalez Torres with the piñatas. This dance diagram is a nod to Andy Warhol's early screen prints, which were of the foxtrot and different kinds of ballroom dances that were famously also displayed on the floor. And so oftentimes our work has this kind of, layers of contextual information and references, and sometimes you might get it and sometimes not. And but we're excited that it's in there for those who are curious or interested. And this project also has a takeaway poster that is the dance diagram. And so you can take it home and learn the choreography yourself as well.
With another nod to Felix Gonzalez Torres with his takeaways, for sure. And a big part of that project, of course, were these disco balls that Janelle and I customized to combine the mutual color palettes of Norway, the United States, and the Dominican Republic, as well as some of the language of these three countries onto the disco balls that would spin above.
And continuing this conversation around hybridity, these are a pair of Adidas Superstar sneakers who were made famous by Run DMC, who are also kind of famous within our particular neighborhood of Queens, New York, and Hollis, Queens, shout out. And so this was a piece where we took these Adidas Superstar sneakers and we customized them with kind of very traditional Rusemaling folk kind of painting, Norwegian painting, as well as these kind of nationalistic motifs from the Dominican Republic and the Dominican flag on top of those mashed together. And there's also these kind of diamond studded soles, and that's also a reference to a kind of diamonds on the sole of your shoes, which is a Paul Simon, Art Garfunkel song, who are also from Queens. And so thinking about these different kinds of references and mixing up our own kind of personal iconography into that.
And on that end, that bacalao and clipfisk are these this material, this animal, this kind of this history that really embodies what Janelle was just saying. In that clipfisk is salted cod that is fished off in northern Norway, and that this food stuff that has like a very, very, very long shelf life and was able to be brought on ships during colonialism, that the conquistadors brought to the global south, which then became this really popular food, bacalao, and is very much like considered one of the national foods of the Dominican Republic and in other communities as well. And so this fish that connects Norway and the Dominican Republic, we're interested in that kind of continuity, that kind of synchronicity between these two disparate geographies. And then how, food is such a large part of how we find ourselves embedded in culture and how we find ourselves connected to culture, and also as an oral history. as a continuum, connecting you with your forebears. And so we talked with our mom about recipes that she learned from our abuela in Dominican Republic about how to make rice and beans, and also like how to make panakake and like Norwegian foods, and then a few ideas about how to combine these foods together. And so this is another kind of example of a takeaway poster that foregrounds this sort of hybridity.
So before we get to this next kind of group of works, I just want to go back to the chat and read out some questions or kind of weave through some answers. And so Natalie asks, I noticed many of the gallery pics have different seating or objects on the gallery floor. I think Natalie maybe is referencing to a link in the chat to a show to our website, to some of those pictures on the website. It's how visitors interact with the gallery space factored in while you initially construct your work, or is it an aspect that becomes important later when the work is finished and ready to be installed? And I think that probably depends on which project. And so something like Everybody Loves to Dance, we're designing this dance floor to be participatory. Something like the hinged paintings, we're also designing to be participatory. And when we were thinking about how we can add in seating, that was also thinking about how people could get comfy and have a different experience, possibly like moving them around. We also had an audio tour in that exhibition. And so we wanted someplace where people would be comfortable enough to sit and listen to the whole audio tour rather than just sort of like walking in the gallery and leaving. And so I would say that that's pretty contextual for each show or each project, but it's something that we always are kind of questioning in terms of is the work accessible to people, and how can people participate in the work depending on the space, the limitations of the space, the limitations of the context as well. And so right now we have done projects where everything in the space is movable and you can interact and create and play with, and you can actually check out the space to like hold a music video or a birthday party or an activist meetup, or a professor could check out the space to hold a class. But we've also had straight gallery shows in museums where the kind of culture of that space was not to touch anything, and we were asked to kind of respect that in terms of how the space ran and what they were able to do in terms of how they staff and monitor the space as well. We also had a question regarding, Emily asks, on your gallery pictures and in the pieces we're looking at, a lot of your pieces are very 3D and incorporate plenty of textures and colors. I was curious about your process in creating these pieces was like, because it's a lot more of a physical process. And Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about the hand in our work?
Yeah, I think Janelle and I are really interested in being transparent and honest about the presence of the jazz hands, the presence of the hands, like that you can tell when looking at most of our work how it was made. For one, because we're not necessarily interested in this sort of this guise of expertise, that we're very much okay with this idea that we're constantly learning new things and learning how to make these things. And we're often working Janelle and I live on different coasts, and we have been for a while. And so sometimes when we work together, we're working at our, at our mom's house in Queens on the kitchen table or in the garage, and that all of these considerations are present in the work. And so there's that sort of surface availability for the viewer to see how something was done, right? And so leaving sort of like a breadcrumb trail, that the technique, the gesture, like how something was made, reveals its own layer of material meaning, of relational meaning, and that going back to that idea of authorship, like you can tell that multiple things have been done, but it doesn't really matter who does what, is also interesting to us to play with, and that Janelle, it's a lot of our work together is very playful. And so the material that we're working with, most of the material we're working with, whether it's a photograph or a video or a sculpture or a drawing, we're not interested in these things being like fixed, static objects, that we're very interested in like the living condition and how these objects might morph. And so oftentimes that winds up revealing a lot of sculptural or physical interventions, I suppose. Yeah.
And that's a really nice tie into Jose's question, which material has the most complexity when making an art piece? And I think that we're continually trying new materials and different strategies. And sometimes there's an ease and sometimes there's a stumble as well. Sometimes there's a kind of dance and a learning curve. And sometimes we're teaching each other things. One of us might be familiar with the process and much more than the other one. And or somebody that we're collaborating with might be captaining that part of a process as well. And so, yeah, I think one of the things we enjoy about our collaboration is that we're always up for learning new things and trying things and challenging ourselves. This next project that is on the screen that you're looking at is a performance piece. And so we also work in performance. We asked our mom to be the umpire for this piece called Competitions. And there was a question that really led into this so beautifully. And the question was regarding, somebody asked, I've considered collaborating with my sister and I'm wondering how you manage to collaborate equally without getting super competitive. So this series came out of this idea about one being this idea of sibling rivalry and being competitive with one's sibling, and also the joy of the competitions that we had with each other growing up. We would also often compete with each other as a game, so who could do something for longer, and we would just make up things on the spot with whatever we would to amuse ourselves. But we'd also sort of see if we could, how long we could do something together. And so sometimes our competitions were sort of against ourselves with a high score as well. And I think more so than while we may be big competitive with each other, I think that was sort of on the surface. I think we've always been super supportive of each other when it comes down to it. And so I think that maybe one of the ways that we kind of dug into this idea of being competitive was when our collaborative work maybe sometimes started stepping on the toes of our individual practice, when something that we were doing in our individual works became very similar to something that we suggested doing as a collaborative team. And when we got uncomfortable with those kinds of having these, maybe we started feeling a little bit possessive about something that was going on in our own studio, we realized maybe we should just, if that's something that we're, that's uncomfortable, maybe we should dig into that instead of avoid it. And so we will show some work where we start taking our individual practices and really collapsing it on top of each other and taking out this idea of authorship. And so I could start something and Lisa could finish it. We could pass it back and forth multiple times, but it initiated from our individual studios rather than coming together and working collaboratively on purpose, quote unquote. And so these performance pieces, we're kind of making fun of this idea of a competition and being competitive as siblings. And our mom is holding up the sign that says round one, there's no bad weather, there's only bad clothing, which is a very common Norwegian saying. And the contest here is to strip down to our long underwear as fast as we can. And we're wearing kind of equal amounts of clothing that was all, kind of found in our mom's house in Queens, where we were staying at the time. This is a show in New York. And so we raided her kind of closet and storage of winter clothes and winter gear, and we have equal amounts of clothing on.
And you'll notice that, to add to that, where nothing is ever thrown away, or at least when we were growing up, nothing is ever thrown away, everything is mended, and that these are resources. Like this winter clothing, for example, you can see there's a range of items that are either handmade, like Janelle and I are wearing matching knit hats, which again speaks to Janelle and I having very many overlapping shared experiences and even outfits. And some of this stuff is from the early 80s, and some of it might be a little bit newer. And as Janelle mentioned, it was a very unattractive striptease in a way, and then it led into these other kind of sequence of competitions. And so I really like, Janelle, how you were responding to this idea about just engaging deeply with that competition. So bringing it up and talking about it, and not assuming that those feelings don't exist, but rather just treating it head on and treating it as a plastic material that's interesting and that we can talk about and play with. And so this was also the first time we had done a live performance. Janelle and I consider much of the work that we do very performative, but oftentimes it was documented either in a video or through very DIY photography. And this was one of the first times we were requested to do it live. And at first we were very hesitant at first, and then decided to again try it out, like that same ethos of like let's try new things, and let's just constantly be novices. And so that some of these antics would reference like double dare, or like beauty pageants, or these sorts of like ridiculous levels of competition. And this is one of those, maybe one of the pieces, right, where there's kind of seating that's integrated into the show, these bean bags. And you'll notice later on in the presentation where this pattern on the bean bag is a translation of a painting on paper. So we're also just interested, like, what happens when a pattern or a gesture or a material consideration is filtered through, almost like when you translate, when you play the game of telephone, and when you try to do something in different sorts of ways, the meaning changes, and also how to engage the viewer, and how to make, as Janelle mentioned, an experience more accessible and more comfortable. And many times when it's just not, like show exhibitions where there's no seating at all, and not that that these seats are very low to the ground, and that's not going to be accessible for everyone, but also having shows where we've made plinths and desks and kind of interactive furniture, which could be touched and sat on in a variety of ways. And you can see here the drawings on the right. Here is a kind of close-up of these, which we think of these also as like found objects, right, Janelle? Like these shells, for example.
Yeah, so the shells are collaged from Xeroxes and books and magazines, and they're on top of flash and gouache works on paper that similarly are this kind of back and forth patterning that we had been working on in the studio as well. And so the one on the far right has a magnifying glass or magnifying lens, I should say, kind of in front of it as well, and so it becomes also more sculptural. But we're also really interested in this idea of like what's in the front versus what's in the background, and then kind of mixing up many different ways of making things. And so the work on the screen right now is another one of those hinged paintings. It's also, again, not a square, it's more of like a strange doorway perhaps, with these kind of found objects behind it. And it's actually a drop cloth that we used during the making of the other work in the show, and then repainted back into as well to kind of finish it as a painting in its own right. The work in this show was made when we were kind of mining our childhood home in Queens after our father died, and we came back home to help clean it out. And so we kind of went through a lot of the things that we were getting rid of in the house, and decided that they were going to become material for sculptures and for wall works, and to kind of play with those things that were really banal, sometimes had really like negative or boring or kind of stupid almost connotations in terms of like our own personal references to them, to see how they could change and become something totally different.
And in many of the ways that you have these conversations with each other, with your professors, this idea of a charge of a material, and knowing, or just really believing this idea that these TV dinner trays that Janelle and I grew up with, that they carry this history and this resonance and this patina of use and interaction and pop culture and like all of that stuff, and that can be, like Janelle used that word mining, like that could be mined and become embodied and transformed into this work when it's combined with other ephemera and with other sorts of little bits and pieces that we collage together in sculptural ways.
And so this is a sculpture that has like medical equipment and old furniture parts and things we found on the street, things that were found in that house. And it has things that we both consider, kind of like a conch shell, or this kind of this salt lamp, these kind of beautiful natural organic objects, and these really man-made things as well. And so kind of one of the things that we're interested in is this, this conversation of our hands we talked about. So these are casts of our actual hands with silly putty stretched between them. And we're also really interested in this, this dialogue between all of these materials, things that are found, things that are found and then repurposed or activated in some kind of way, things that are casts of things that already exist. So there's a play between objects in the installation oftentimes of what's real, what's made, what's a sort of fake, a quote unquote, and all of these different languages of things that are handcrafted or based on a sort of particular tradition, or things that are hacked together or jerry-rigged as well. And one of the things we're also interested in the ways in which the sculpture is very much a drawing in space as much as it's a sculpture. And the work that you see leaning against the wall is a sort of flat work that operates as a painting, but it also operates as a sculpture as well.
It's a great segue into this show Resistors, where we use that image as the poster. Also that the title, I think, is really indicative and embodies this practice that Janelle and I really try to repeat over and over again in terms of being playful with language. And that these double entendres, or these opportunities for language to function in different ways simultaneously, we often try to resort to those sorts of techniques in the titles or in a takeaway poster, like in this "No, it is opposition," within this that kind of palindromic capacity, like the risograph zine that Rachel mentioned earlier. And so this is this is a kind of collage of scenes from this show Resistors at ASU, where yellow was a huge unifying color palette. Sometimes, like when something like color comes up, for example, right? Janelle and I will have conversations about the metaphorical and material associations of what color we might want to really dive into, and that oftentimes guides us into how we make decisions.
And as part of the show, we were doing a residency where we got to make work in the gallery before people were invited to come and see it as an exhibition. And so we did bring some work with us, but a lot of the work that we created was on site. And we were given kind of access to things that the museum was going to throw away. And one of the things we're interested in is looking at the ways in which gallery walls could sort of function as sculptural apparatuses in themselves, rather than disappearing as a kind of neutral space. This show was in 2017, and so it was also in Arizona. And so this idea of the wall with a capital W was very much in the news and very much on people's minds. And this idea of resisting, in terms of resisting dominant cultural ideas, in terms of thinking about how folks can resist in different kinds of ways. And so while this is a sculpture, it also kind of feels performative in ways in which we're trying to cut through this wall, or in gestures of our hands are cast and sort of holding out ropes, or throwing things, or punching through, or raising a fist in solidarity within and through the wall itself.
And there are moments when you can see through the wall so that the wall can be penetrable. And we took a Sawzall and we cut through and we burrowed through the wall so that it's completely porous. And it sort of also provided these frames to view different parts of the exhibition through these windows that we would either insert sunglass lenses into, or two-way mirrors, or open cutouts where you could see little vignettes that were happening inside the wall, including for more casts of our hands, like in this instance, holding onto a grapefruit, like and talking about, like as Janelle mentioned, this kind of art historical reference. So this would reference Yoko Ono's Grapefruit, and that book really emblematizing this idea of collaboration and kind of collective responses to prompts. So that kind of happened playfully throughout the entire show. And also that these are further examples, like with this work, where we take, as Janelle put it, like these kind of banal or like everyday kind of objects, like in this case, the armature of a pop-up tent, and then reconsider its use or misuse it kind of flip it on its head to reconsider it in a different kind of way. And that on the peaks of these little armature pyramidal shapes, there are these little sculptures that we would make together, and with sometimes, like I think that Bowie also collaborated on some of these kind of lumpy sculptures as well. And that the show, here's some screen prints like from that risograph that we made in Doha, Qatar with VCUQ, where we met Rachel. Some of that work translated then into these takeaway posters that were available that we switched out. So like, I think that it was each week, or I don't remember, Janelle, I think it was each week that we put a different poster out. And this, again, like that kind of verbiage of your sister will take her turn now can be seen as both playful as well as a call to action. And Janelle and I often return to this quote. I'm gonna mess it up though, Janelle, like the Francis Elise quote.
Doing things, sometimes doing something poetic can be political, sometimes doing something political can be poetic, I think is the gist of it. I'm not saying that exactly, but it's a
Yeah, and I think that it, like, in terms of these overlap, this Venn diagram of joyfulness and playfulness and activism and advocacy for communities and being within communities. I think Janelle and I are constantly centering and trying to learn how to do that better, and that some of our projects carry that kind of poetry more indirectly or directly than others.
And this space had this beautiful hallway with all of these niches that had a glass brick that let natural light into the gallery space. So you walk through this kind of hallway, and on the left you can see all of these little niches. And on the right, what you're looking at is a workshop that we did before for the kind of opening of the show, in which we worked with kids and we asked them if they would put on a blindfold. And the piece is called Unseen Futures, and it's asking them to envision what they want to bring into their future, what they want the future to hold, and to think about that while blindfolded and to make an object. And so they made these small small clay objects that were placed inside these niches that had these glass bricks. And so the light shines through and kind of illuminates each of these objects. And so you could go and kind of look at each individual one, but the work was really about this kind of collective idea of all of us having these ideas about what we want to see in our future. And it basically frames the exhibition as you walk in. And so kids could also return and find their sculpture later if they wanted to. They lasted and they stayed in the niches for the length of the exhibition. And so sometimes these are methods that we also use as kind of like crowdsourcing or participatory interventions, where maybe you can't touch or participate during the whole length of the show, but maybe there are certain events or workshops that happen in conjunction with an exhibition or with a project.
And with that said, so those kind of, again, bring it back to the takeaway poster and this kind of participatory thing, the way that we think of like those openings in that hallway accumulate and kind of grow and change in terms of like these objects collecting and creating that framing of the show. We really are super interested in this idea of the takeaway poster as being this sculpture that dwindles, that changes shape, that not only can a viewer take something away for free, and that also that the object has a life beyond this kind of gallery context, and that it goes and lives somewhere else, but also that the sculpture itself changes size, which is fun. And that sculpture, you can see that this takeaway poster is then reconsidered in a different way, just as like we consider other like works on paper or sculptural materials. Like you'll notice perhaps that the pink jacket that is included in this sculpture on the right was located in a different sculpture earlier, in the salt lamp as well. And the Won't Lovers Revolt Now poster was reconsidered in terms of color palette, and then kind of used as almost like a paperweight for the weaving that's hanging on this sculpture at Breck in Brooklyn.
And this sculpture has kind of found textiles that we dyed and altered, and also this kind of sampler of weaving. This project was made while we were doing a textile residency with our mother, and it's a woven textile trying out all of these different patterns and yarns and seeing what would happen on the loom. as well.
And so that idea of like that a project can provide an opportunity to learn, again, that will come up again and again. And this idea of how one thing can turn into another and transform itself is also seen here, where our works on paper are filtered through conversation, that we talk about it as a group, that we learn about different things and contribute different layers to then they become these knit paintings. So here's where you could see the reference to the beanbag, that pattern exists in both the work on paper, a knit painting as we usually call them, and then as the beanbag. And that these works go back and forth, and sometimes we'll make a work on paper, it will we'll transform it with our mother into a knit painting, and then sometimes we'll go back to the original work on paper or make another work on paper that then responds. So there's constantly like a call and response between these different practices.
And I put a link in the chat to some exhibitions that really focus on this kind of collaborative project with our mom, Bodhild. And what's on the screen now is we've been really thinking about how can we change up some of the formats and continue to expand this collaborative textile practice that we're developing with our mom. And so how can we break some of the rules that sort of, the rules always kind of sneak up on you without even saying them out loud. You might have these kind of firm boundaries about what you're going to do. And then once you make enough work, you sort of realize, oh, we've have this kind of way of doing things. How can we do something completely different or do the opposite of that? And what will change if we do that? And so these works are starting to include new ways of our hands all coming together in a piece, different kinds of materiality and different kinds of textile techniques all within the same work as well.
So in one work, there might be embroidery, there might be crochet, there might be different patterns of knitting, and then they all kind of come together in different sorts of ways. Janelle mentioned the Textile Arts Center residency that we were privileged to do with our mom. It's a really wonderful organization based in Brooklyn. Janelle and I participated by distance, like I was in Florida and Janelle was in California, and her mother was like the main physical participant, and we would visit when we could and also communicate through these different structures that we're all very comfortable with now, like video conferencing and text, and just using all of those structures to collaborate as well. And through that residency, we were able to learn and reinforce different techniques. And then it culminated in this exhibition where we brought together the rag rug that you can see that's on the floor and draped over a wooden armature is a rag rug that our mother's mother, our Bestamud, made is one of the very few materials that we have to represent her. And so our mother responded to the rag rug by making the knit painting in the upper left that's draped over the armature. And so there was a negotiation of this like continuum of knowledge, of craft knowledge, but in a response to motherhood. And with that also, we were really interested in responding to the patterns and teachings of Annie Albers. So there are many different patterns within the installation that speak to Annie Albers as well as a sort of matriarch of Western textiles, for example. Within that installation was this takeaway poster. And then just to sort of finish up, again, returning to this idea, I think of like playing constantly with structures for collaboration, that there's not just one way of doing it. You don't like in terms of like, I think many times when we were starting out, maybe Janelle and I had these false assumptions that the work had to be made in tandem, simultaneously, physically together. And now we're very interested in seeing what are all the ways that we can challenge that rule, that illusion. And also these different structures for collaboration are, again, opportunities to learn different things and to put all of our hands in the mix.
One of the things that we're also, constantly interested in is how can we bring whatever's happening in our personal and kind of, in our kind of psychic life as well into the work, into what's happening with ourselves and our families, and embed that into the choices and decisions that we're making. And so for the past few exhibitions that we've had with our mom, we've also invited Lisa's son Bowie to create an audio tour of the works in the show, where he talks a little bit about what he's looking at, and also asks the listener different questions about them. And this came up also in terms of thinking about how you might encounter an exhibition, how much time you might spend with a work if you were listening to somebody talk about it. If you couldn't see, what would your experience of the work be if it had an audio component, if you have a different level of vision as well? So thinking about access, thinking also about this idea of familial life being juicy and wonderful, and not just necessarily relegated to something as a sort of distraction to more quote unquote serious work. And so oftentimes we're really interested in bringing in something that's familial and personal into work that's shared publicly, because we want to value our family life, our children, our identities as daughters, our identities as mothers, our identities as educators, rather than sort of being a sort of slave to this archetype of the artist, which is usually male, which is usually a kind of soul genius, and is also usually self-destructive, isn't necessarily kind of somebody who's well integrated into the social or activist fabric of a community. It's sort of like a lone wolf, and sort of beating themselves up in the studio. And so we're really interested in creating a new model of what it's like to be an artist in the world for ourselves. And Lisa, do you want to play a clip of Bowie, one of the tracks from one of the audio tours?
Yeah, sure. So we've played around with different ways that we can do this. Sometimes there's a headset that's available for viewers. Sometimes there's a QR code. So there's definitely different ways that we can try to make this audio available. And over the summer, Bowie is up for creating a new audio tour for the works that we're developing right now for the fall.
Hello. Now it's time to look for the painting that looks like a zebra. What does it? Close your eyes for 10 minutes. What does it smell like? What does it look like? I love your imagination. It's so good. Take a friend if you want to. Okay, now it's time to go, lovers. We're trying to go.
And I do want to say that his audio tours are unscripted. These are totally like his contribution, and that we're also interested in that. Like, I think that through collaboration, there's oftentimes less control, that even though Janelle and I may be control freaks in other aspects of our life, so to speak, we're also really interested in like seeing what happens when you take away the script and when you experiment and allow yourself to be surprised by the end result. I'm gonna stop my share now, and we can open up, I think, everything to like let's do a conversation.
And maybe we start with there's a question in the chat by Rachel J. What's it like being individual women and then as a female duo in the art world? That's a great question. And I think one of the reasons that Lisa and I really enjoy collaborating is the kind of courage and freedom that we feel from working together, that having a teammate makes some of the pressures or some of the we feel a little bit more less self-conscious to do performances or to do things that are maybe outside of what we feel like are our in our own, kind of personal, individual bodies of work. And in our collaborative practice, I think early on, we kind of committed to it being completely free and sort of open to doing anything and everything, as long as we felt like it was productive and we were going to learn something from it. So I think, I think that one of the things we love about our duo is the kind of power that we feel that we have in terms of supporting each other and our own commitment to trying new things as a team. Lisa, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the major privileges of working together, is this shared, this sort of buoyancy of courage that we can offer each other. Because I think in these institutional contexts, like whether it's academia, whether it's like quote unquote art world, or the sort of structure, the constructed ideas we have of what that's supposed to be, it can be very overwhelming and very intimidating for an individual. Not for everybody, but for me, for sure. And when I work with Janelle, I think that there's a different sense of a bravery that comes, like, I don't give as much of a fuck, and because it's like, it can be much more funny. The work can make less sense in terms of like having having this like linear narrative arc that where all the work makes sense together in a neat package. Like, we can kind of do whatever we want, and I think I feel less of that freedom when I'm working individually in my studio. Of course, there's other beautiful things of working individually, but I think that that definitely like a sense of camaraderie and mutual reciprocity and support comes from working with Janelle, and I think that's something that's super lucky. I'm trying to see if there's other questions of the chat, but for sure, people can unmute themselves. Ha ha ha. This is a funny, okay. So there's great questions. So Anthony's question, with the pandemic going on, how has that affected creating work for you both? That's a great question. I think, Janelle, you and I were already pretty, we love using the United States Postal Service. Shout out to USPS. I love USPS. I love getting new stamps. I love using the like the bulk rate packages. So Janelle and I are package mavens. Like, we love sending each other a good care package, and there's like overlap with how we collaborate. Like, we'll send each other a care package that has cookies, but also has a sculptural part. Like, I'm thinking of those hands, Janelle, that I sent you.
Oh yeah, that was a great package.
So like, we utilize the mail. We text each other and FaceTime and Zoom. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Like, we just try to use every single structure, either well or terribly.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's challenging, though, is that we're used to being able to have these kind of work intensives with each other, whether that be when we physically arrive to install a show. If we have a large installation window, we usually try to take that as a way to kind of finish work on site together, as almost as a residency, or a sort of self-imposed residency where one of us goes to the other one's location and we'll have a kind of work intensive or a research intensive or a particular project that we're performing or photographing or shooting, that we plan these things out. And so not having that ability to see each other, I think, has been challenging. And we definitely miss each other. And we've also, in our personal lives, had a lot going on that we wanted to share with each other. I just had a baby 4 months ago, and Lisa's due in a month, and we haven't been able to be with each other throughout these pregnancies. So that's been, I think, more hard, honestly, than it has been to be apart in terms of the studio. But just like the studio practice, we also I always feel like I have somebody in my corner, and she's right there with me and I'm right there with her, even if we can't be together physically. And we've also made work about that kind of physical distance whilst trying to stay together through photographic works that we're collaging together during this time as well.
Yeah. There's been a lot of stress and sadness. I think oftentimes when I'm talking with Janelle, it's like my go-to defense mechanism is like try to be like playful and funny about it, but it has sucked for sure. And for lots of reasons. I mean, I think that there's so many layers of trauma that are circulating within the past 4, 5, 6 years. That the pandemic is certainly a big part of, and that distancing from each other. Yeah, it is really difficult. And I think that it maybe reinforces also the commitment to like, let's figure out how to do it regardless, maybe. I like this question of which artwork did both of you agree was the least favorite?
That's such a good question. Nobody talks about their quote unquote failures or things that they didn't like, that because I can definitely think of things that I've made on my own studio
There are oftentimes things that Janelle hates that I really like.
That's true. That's really true. Sometimes we joke about the fact that like one of the things that Lisa was talking about, how, you know, we can kind of do whatever we want, but there's also two critics involved at the same time too. And so there's double criticality, and we both have different lenses that we're looking at things. And when we're
trying to think if there's one that we agree on, because honestly, the first thing I think of is one we don't agree on. Janelle and I have this piece. Is it, oh, I can't remember what it's called right now, but we constructed this kind of lumpy sculpture on top of a shaving mirror accordion, right? So that when it's installed on the wall, it can be moved in and out. And I we inserted like this little mirror into it. And I think it's hilarious because to me, it like references surveillance. And it's also reminds me of like the highly problematic and highly nostalgic movie Goonies, where the punching, the boxing glove comes out of his outfit. And Janelle has sometimes you've been like, no. But I'm trying to think if there's one that we both agree we're like, that failed.
I don't know if we both agree on them. I can think of a couple that I've been like, oh, I really don't like that. I don't want to show it. And you've been like, I like that. We should show that work.
I think maybe you're more.
I'm honestly more of the naysayer. I have to.
Or we could put it as you're the more astute critic, and I'm like, yeah, it's funny. You know, I don't know. Well, like at our mom's house, there's a sculpture that both of us are like, what is this doing? And we've never shown. It's the, you know, the Janelle, the sphere that is like encrusted with objects. I think both of us are like, what is happening? But we're also so used to this idea of never throwing anything away that it's still in storage, even though we don't like it.
One of the things that Lisa and I are really interested in, instead of artworks becoming this, like, you know, when it's finished, it's fixed and it goes into storage and it's archived. We don't really think of our work like that. We think of our work as something that can just become new, kind of like a starter culture for a new piece, you know, like it's like sourdough or kombucha or something like that, where you can like take a piece of it and then it can grow into something new and have this residue of a continuing conversation of a thought that you had when you made it. When it had its first iteration. And so oftentimes we will go through the work, you know, that's been in a show, and we'll kind of mine it to make new works and pieces. So sometimes work that we really don't like becomes something that actually we really like in the future iteration of reusing a piece or a part of it. And that, I think, is also kind of resisting this idea of an artwork being a kind of fixed commodity, you know, that it's something that's for sale, and it's something that is this kind of, that it is a kind of finalized thought, and rather than something that's a kind of active, growing thing that can morph and change.
I think that question and how you responded to that, Janelle, I think that we should totally use a mother in one of our next projects. Like the mother of kombucha is such a lumpy, shifty, fertile kind of material. Like maybe we should make some kombucha in our next show. And have some mothers hanging out, you know?
Mother, yeah.
Another thing that comment made me think of is this project that I was trying to convince Janelle to do for a long time, where we would wear rooster.
You're still trying to convince me to do that. Yeah, we
would wear rooster like hats and then get into a fisticuffs. I think I try to like, let's see how much we can embarrass ourselves, but sometimes we don't do these things.
We have a lot of outtakes from our performance projects that are also done with photographs that we have a kind of performative action that we document via photography, and the photographs get shown. That's not necessarily a live performance. And I would say that we have a lot of outtakes from those as well. Yeah.
This question is also really interesting. What kind of audience do you think you draw in the most with your work, or is it kind of all over the place?
I think one of the things we've embraced with our collaborative work is that we've embraced the idea that it can be all over the place. And so we've shown it at art fairs in a very kind of, kind of consumer-driven, collector-driven gallery art world context. We've shown it at university galleries, which tend to be a more academic setting, and nonprofits. I think what both of us are really excited about showing it in kind of community-based nonprofits or artist-run spaces that are less commercially motivated and more motivated towards showing experimental work. But we've also shown them in kind of commercial art world spaces as well. And we've also, kind of made text pieces that are functional sort of in print or in magazine kind of forms. We've been asked lately to like produce like virtual pieces for virtual exhibitions or digital works. And so I think one of the things we're interested in is whenever we get an opportunity to really consider what that particular audience is for that opportunity, and how can we kind of be really conscious of that when we're just making the decisions about that particular body of work. And so like the show at Arizona State University Art Museum, very much aware that it's a university gallery, it's in Arizona, that there's a kind of educational component that's also a family-friendly educational component that they were interested in us kind of interacting with as well, was part of that exhibition. And then also thinking about the timing in terms of it being 2017 and Trump being elected in 2016 and having this conversation around, activism, resistance, the border wall, et cetera, as well, during that particular time. And also Arizona being considered, a pretty conservative place relative to the place where we're from as well. And so how to create a conversation that was an invitation to engage as much as possible for the audience that we knew were potentially going to see that exhibition.
These are great questions, everyone. And I love thanks for sharing all the love in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing everything, for being so generous. If someone has a burning question, Anthony put up a little heart. That's sweet. Oh, all the little hearts popping up. I love it. If someone has a burning question, I'm like, I want to do too.
And one thing I think is important that we didn't note is that our mom doesn't consider herself an artist. She grew up knitting in Norway since she was about 9 years old. She grew up in a community where she skied to school. They got electricity, I think, when she was like 9 or 10 as well, and was in a community where everything was so many things were handmade. But the way that we grew up in Queens, she was an elementary school teacher. She was in school and then she was an elementary school teacher, and so she knit and sewed and mended things for us as a family. But it was really only until she was in retirement that she took up knitting again. And it was also after our father passed that we realized that knitting was this really amazing process and tool for both her collective healing and as a way for us to come together and kind of create a project where we learned more about each other and had conversations about labor, about feminism, about value, about aesthetics, about all these different possible things that would be a kind of new chapter for us as a family to come together around. So we often think of the works with our mom. Lisa, I like when you call it a love letter to our mom, which we think of a lot of these installations and projects as.
Well, thank you so much. This is really amazing.
Thanks for having us, Rachel.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I wish we could really be together in person, but at least we're here in this space. So.
Yeah. And I really look forward to meeting some of you on Monday for our experimental drawing workshop. I put down some materials that I shared with Rachel, but really don't feel, if you don't have some of that stuff, don't even worry about it. We're just going to hang out and like do skill shares and like talk about what happens when we throw stuff at stuff, and it's going to be fun.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for signing in, everybody. Thanks for joining us.